The Winchester came up fast in Della Whittaker's hands, the stock finding her shoulder the way it had 100 times before on lonely roads, and she sighted down the barrel at the man crouched by the dead campfire with blood soaking through his shirt. "Do not move," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her heart was slamming hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "I have heard what you did to Ezra Vance, and I will not hesitate." The man raised his hand slowly, palms open, and did not reach for the pistol lying just out of arm's reach in the pine needles beside him. He was perhaps 30, maybe a few years past it, with a week's growth of dark beard and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He looked at her the way a man looks at a rattler he has already decided not to provoke. "I did not kill him, ma'am," he said. His voice was low, rough with thirst, but steady. "Whatever they are saying in town, I did not put a bullet in Ezra Vance. They are saying you shot him in the back over a grazing dispute and left him for the coyotes." Della's finger rested along the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, a habit her father had beaten into her before he had ever let her carry a rifle alone on the delivery routes. "They have your name on a reward notice nailed to the mercantile door. $50, Louis Ashford, dead or alive. $50. He almost laughed, though the sound came out more like a wince. "Cheap. For a murder they invented whole cloth. Convince me. I am trying to, if you would let me lower one arm long enough to show you something instead of just talking." She hesitated, then gave a short nod, and he peeled back the collar of his shirt with 2 fingers to reveal a wound in his shoulder, ragged and inflamed. The kind that came from a rifle ball entering from behind and tearing out through muscle, rather than a clean wound taken face to face in a fair fight. A man does not shoot another man down like they claim, and then take a bullet in his own back running from the very killing he is accused of starting, he said. "I was ambushed on the Bell Pass trail 6 days back. 2 riders, maybe 3. Vance was one of them, far as I could tell before everything went to smoke and noise. When it was done, Vance was dead and I was bleeding into the snow. And by the time I got myself down off that mountain, Garrett Prescott's men were already spreading word through Larkspur Gulch that I had murdered him for the grazing rights." Della studied him a long moment, the rifle still level, though something in her had already begun to shift the way it did when a column of figures in the county ledger did not add correctly. She had grown up reading truth in the small details men forgot to arrange, and this detail was not arranged. It was too inconvenient a wound for a man wanting to be believed innocent to have invented. "You are saying the Prescotts framed you." "I am saying I have driven cattle through that pass for the Whitcomb outfit and the Halloran spread and half the small ranchers in this valley for 6 years. And Silas Prescott has wanted that pass closed to everybody but his own herds for at least 4 of them. Vance worked for Prescott. So does the man most likely to have fired the shot that finished him. He said it plainly, without heat, the way a man recites something he has already turned over in his mind too many times to feel angry about anymore, only tired. "I do not expect you to take my word over a reward poster, ma'am. I am only asking you not to shoot me before I have had the chance to prove it some other way." Della lowered the rifle an inch, then another, until the barrel pointed at the frozen ground between them instead of at his chest. "I am not in the habit of shooting wounded men," she said. "But I am also not in the habit of believing strangers who tell me convenient stories in the woods." "Fair enough." He lowered his hand slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at his shoulder. "Might I ask what a woman is doing riding the Tanner Ridge Trail alone with a Winchester, and unless I am mistaken, a wagon full of books parked back down that draw?" "I am the county's traveling librarian, Mr. Ashford, Della Whittaker. I carry books and letters and newspapers to families too far out for the mail carrier to bother with, and I do not go anywhere in this county unarmed, because I have found that men do not always ask politely before helping themselves to what a woman carries." She let that settle, watching his face for the flicker of insult or amusement that told her more about a man than most conversations did. He only nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected about the world. "Then you have better judgment than most who have already convicted me without a trial." "I have not decided anything yet." She slung the rifle over her shoulder at last, though she kept it close. "I only know that a man bleeding from a wound in his back is not the same as a man who murdered another in cold blood and rode away clean. Whether that is enough to matter to the county judge is another question entirely." That was how it began, on a cold, gray afternoon in the middle of April, in the year 1887, with unusually heavy snow still clinging to the high shoulders of the mountains above Larkspur Gulch, waiting for the first warm days to come loosen it into thunder. Della did not shoot him, and she did not turn him over to the sheriff that day either, though she told herself as she rode back down toward her wagon that she had made no promise, that she remained free to change her mind the moment good sense reasserted itself. She left him a tin of beans and half a loaf of bread from her own provisions, and a strip of clean cloth torn from a petticoat she kept for exactly this kind of emergency, because a librarian who traveled alone through mountain country learned to prepare for wounds as readily as for weather. "I will be back through this way in 3 days," she told him before she left. "I'm not promising you anything, Mr. Ashford, except that I intend to look into this myself before I decide what is true." "That is more than most have offered me since Vance died," he said. "I will take it." She rode away with the taste of the encounter still sharp in her mouth, unsettled by how easily she had lowered her rifle, and more unsettled still by the fact that she could not stop turning his wound over in her mind, examining it from every angle the way she might examine a disputed line in a property deed. The town of Larkspur Gulch sat where 2 creeks came together beneath the shadow of Tanner's Ridge, a county seat proper with a courthouse of dressed stone that looked almost too dignified for the mud and false front buildings crowded around it. Della's father had built the subscription library there 15 years before, hauling the first crates of books over Bell Pass by mule before there was even a wagon road, and when he had died of a winter fever 3 years past, Della had simply continued the work because it was hers to continue, because families 40 miles out in the high meadows still needed news of the world and something to read through the long white winters, and because she had discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she preferred the open road and the company of her own judgment to anything a settled life in town could offer. She knew the courthouse the way she knew her own wagon, having spent half her childhood underfoot in the recorder's office while her father filed his subscription papers. And she went there now, 3 days after leaving Louis Ashford in the hills, not to town gossip but to the deed books themselves, because deed books did not lie the way men did. Only sometimes the men who kept them lied through omission. The wanted notice was exactly where she had heard it would be, tacked to the mercantile door with Louis Ashford's name in bold type, and a description that made him sound considerably more menacing than the exhausted, wounded man she had left in the hills. $50, dead or alive, for the murder of Ezra Vance, foreman of the Prescott Ranch. She read it twice, then went directly to the recorder's office and asked to see the grazing allotment records for Bell Pass. The clerk, a nervous young man named Whitfield who owed his position to Silas Prescott's influence on the county commission, hesitated before producing the ledger, and hesitation from a records clerk was, in Della's long experience, the surest sign that a ledger held something worth hiding. She found it within the hour, working methodically through the entries the way her father had taught her, and what she found made her sit very still at the long table for a long moment before she copied the relevant pages into her own notebook with careful, deliberate handwriting. The grazing boundary for Bell Pass had been amended 11 days before Ezra Vance's death, filed by Garrett Prescott on his father's behalf, redrawing the line that had stood unchanged for 6 years to place the entire pass within Prescott land, rather than the open range every small rancher in the valley had used since before the county existed. The filing bore a witness signature that Della recognized, having seen it 100 times on other documents, as belonging to a notary who had, according to the courthouse's own daybook, been 40 miles away in Cross Timber on the date the document claimed he had signed it. It was a small thing, a single date on a single page, the kind of detail most men would never think to check. But Della Whitaker had spent her whole life believing that the truth lived in exactly such small things, and she copied the date twice more to be certain her eyes had not deceived her. And then she closed the ledger and thanked the clerk and walked out into the April sunlight with her hands trembling slightly, not from fear this time, but from the particular fury of discovering that a man's life had been weighed against a piece of paper and found less valuable. She did not go straight back to the mountains. She spent that evening and the next day doing what she did best, riding her regular circuit to the outlying homesteads with her wagon of books and letters, listening far more than she spoke. She heard the story of Ezra Vance's death recited to her 3 separate times by 3 separate families, each version slightly different, each one traceable back to the same source. A rider named Jesse Cobb, who had come down from the Prescott ranch the very evening of the killing to spread word before anyone else had a chance to offer another account. She noted that no one she spoke with had actually witnessed the shooting themselves. She noted, too, the careful way people lowered their voices when they mentioned the Prescott name, the particular fear of men who understood that in Larkspur County, the courthouse and the ranch house were not so very far apart, and that speaking too freely against one might cost a family its water rights, its grazing lease, or worse. On the 3rd day, as promised, she rode back up toward the lined shack above Tanner Ridge with her notebook in her saddlebag, and a question she had been carrying the whole way up the mountain. She found Louis Ashford sitting in the shack's doorway, color better than before, his shoulder freshly bound with cloth she did not recognize, which told her he had managed to find help somewhere she had not asked about. He rose when he saw her, favoring the wounded side, and something in his face when their eyes met made her chest tighten in a way she chose, for the moment, not to examine. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." She dismounted and tied her horse without ceremony. "I have found the boundary filing, Mr. Ashford. The one that moved Bell Pass onto Prescott land 11 days before Vance died. It was witnessed by a man who was 40 miles away when he supposedly signed it." Louis went very still. "You went digging in the courthouse records for me." "I went digging in the courthouse records because a discrepancy like that offends me on principle, whether it concerns you or not," she said, though even as the words left her mouth she knew they were not entirely honest, and from the way one corner of his mouth lifted, she suspected he knew it too. "All the same, thank you. Do not thank me yet. A forged date on a document is not the same as proof you did not kill a man, only proof that someone wanted that pass badly enough to lie about who owns it. I need to understand what happened on that trail, all of it, from the beginning." So he told her, sitting across the small fire she helped him build because his shoulder still would not let him gather wood properly. And she listened with the same careful attention she gave to a difficult passage in a book someone had asked her to read aloud, turning each detail over before accepting it. He had been bringing 1,100 head north through Bell Pass toward the railhead at Cross Timber, a drive he had made every spring for 6 years for the Halloran outfit and 2 neighboring ranches who pooled their cattle to save on the cost of separate crews. 3 riders had come down on them from the ridge above the Narrows, and in the confusion of gunfire and stampeding cattle, Louis had seen Ezra Vance fall, had assumed at first that Vance had been shot by his own men in the chaos, until he himself took a ball in the shoulder from behind and understood, in the moment before the world went white with pain, that whoever had planned this had planned for someone to die and had not much cared whose blood ended up on the snow so long as the story that followed served Prescott's purpose. "Jesse Cobb was one of the 3, Louis said. "I am certain of that much. I have ridden with him before, know his seat on a horse, and I saw him plain before the smoke got thick. I could not tell you who fired the shot that killed Vance, only that it did not come from where I stood, and it did not come from my rifle, which had not been fired at all before that day, a fact any man who cared to look at the barrel could confirm easily enough if anyone troubled themselves to look. "No one has looked," Della said quietly. "No one has wanted to. It is easier to hang a drifter than to ask hard questions of a family that controls half the county's water rights and every seat on the commission but one. I am not a drifter." There was an edge in his voice for the first time, quickly smoothed away. "I have worked this valley honestly for 6 years. I have a claim filed on a quarter section down along the river, land I have been building on with every dollar I have not sent home to my sister in Kansas. I had thought before all this that I might finish the house this summer." He stopped, as if he had said more than he intended, and looked into the fire rather than at her. "There is a rocking chair on the porch already. Was my mother's before she passed. I sit in it some evenings and think about what it would mean to actually live there instead of just sleeping there between drives." Della found, unexpectedly, that she did not know what to say to that, and so she said nothing at all, only added another stick to the fire and let the silence hold the shape of what he had told her, a man's whole hope for a settled life laid out plain and unguarded in the space between them. "We cannot prove any of this from a lined shack in the hills," she said finally. "You need witnesses. I need to find out who saw what actually happened on that trail, and I need to do it without the Prescotts learning that anyone is asking. That is a dangerous thing for you to take on, Miss Whitaker. I have been riding this county alone since I was 22, Mr. Ashford. I am considerably harder to frighten off than the reward notice would suggest, and considerably more dangerous with that rifle than you have any evidence of yet." He almost smiled at that, a real smile this time, tired but genuine, and something passed between them that felt less like suspicion now and more like the beginning of an understanding neither of them had words ready for. Over the following week, Della continued her regular circuit, because a sudden change in her habits would draw exactly the kind of attention she could not afford, and because families along her route depended on her deliveries regardless of what else occupied her thoughts. But she used every stop to listen more carefully than she read, asking careful, roundabout questions about the Bell Pass killing, filing away every scrap of information the way she filed away overdue books and unanswered letters, patient and thorough. It was at the Calloway homestead, a full day's ride north along the river, that she found what she needed. Widow Calloway was a sharp-eyed woman of 60 who had buried a husband and raised 4 children on that land, and had earned, in the process, a healthy distrust of anyone who came asking questions on behalf of the Prescotts, which made her considerably more forthcoming once she understood Della was asking on behalf of someone else entirely. "I saw it," the widow said, once she had poured coffee and settled into her own chair with the particular deliberateness of a woman about to unburden herself of something long carried. "I was up on the ridge above the Narrows gathering the last of my sheep before the melt came through, and I saw 3 riders come down on that herd, and I saw one of the Prescott men shoot another one of their own before ever a shot came from the cattle drive side. I did not understand it at the time. I have understood it better since, watching how quick the story changed once it reached town. Would you testify to that if it came to it, before a judge?" The widow's face tightened. "Garrett Prescott holds the note on this land, Miss Whitaker. If I stand up in that courthouse and say his hired man shot his own foreman, I will lose this place inside a month, one way or another, and probably worse than that. I understand the risk. I would not ask if it did not matter. It matters to you because of the cowboy, I expect." The widow's eyes were shrewd, and Della felt heat climb her neck despite herself. "I heard you have been seen riding up toward Tanner Ridge more than your route requires. It matters because an innocent man is being hunted for a murder he did not commit, and because I do not believe the Prescotts should be allowed to redraw the boundaries of a mountain pass with a forged signature and a convenient body," Della said, more sharply than she intended, and the widow only nodded slowly, unoffended, as if she had expected exactly that answer and simply wanted to hear Della say it aloud. "I will think on it," the widow said. "That is the most I will promise today." It was enough, for now, a thread Della could hold onto as she rode back toward town, though the weight of what she was asking of an old woman with everything to lose sat uneasily with her the whole way down the valley. The trouble, when it came faster than she expected. She returned to Larkspur Gulch 3 days later to find her book wagon's canvas slashed open, and a full crate of subscription volumes soaked through and ruined in a spring rain that had clearly been allowed to fall on them deliberately, the wagon having been left uncovered overnight in the yard behind the boarding house where she stabled it. No one had seen anything, or no one would say they had. The mercantile owner, who usually greeted her warmly, now found reasons to be occupied elsewhere when she came in for supplies. A family 2 days out on her regular route sent word by a passing rider that they would not require her services this season, a message so unlike their usual warmth that she understood immediately what had prompted it. Word had traveled that the county librarian was keeping company with the Bell Pass murderer, and word, once loosed in a small mountain county, moved a great deal faster than any wagon could follow it to correct. She found Sheriff Amos Boone in his office that evening, a heavy-set man with tired eyes who had held the job for 11 years by the simple expedient of never crossing Silas Prescott any more than duty absolutely required. "You ought to be careful, Miss Whittaker," he said, not unkindly, when she pressed him about whether any real investigation had been conducted into Vance's death. "Folks are saying things about you I would not want said about my own daughter." "Folks are saying things because Garrett Prescott wants them said, Sheriff. Have you actually examined Louis Ashford's rifle? Have you asked why the man who supposedly murdered Ezra Vance in cold blood was found 6 days later with a bullet wound in his own back?" Boone's jaw worked, and for a moment she thought she saw something like shame cross his weathered face. "I have asked Silas Prescott for permission to interview his men about the particulars," he admitted. "He has told me the matter is settled, and that continued questioning would reflect poorly on this office's judgment, given the reward notice is already posted, and the county commission has expressed satisfaction with how matters stand. The county commission is Silas Prescott and 2 men who owe him money." "That is not something I can help, Miss Whittaker." He would not meet her eyes now. "I have a family to feed and an election in the fall. I am sorry for it, truly, but I cannot go looking for trouble that Silas Prescott has already decided does not exist." She left the sheriff's office with her fists clenched inside her coat pockets, more furious at the world's ordinary cowardice than she had been at any single act of villainy. And it was that fury, still burning, that carried her back up into the hills to find Louis Ashford waiting where she had left him. She told him everything, the ruined books, the frightened family, the sheriff's careful cowardice, and watched his face darken with each detail, not with surprise but with a kind of weary recognition, as if he had expected exactly this and hoped, without much confidence, to be wrong. "This has gone far enough," he said finally. "I will not let them ruin your good name on top of everything else, Della." It was the first time he had used her given name, and neither of them remarked on it, though she felt it land somewhere beneath her ribs. "I am going to turn myself in. That is exactly what they want. No. What they want is for me to keep running, so they can either shoot me for resisting or let me starve up here in the hills until I am too weak to defend myself when they finally do come for me. If I go in on my own, if I demand a proper hearing before witnesses, before the whole town, that is a different thing entirely. They cannot simply shoot a man who walks into the sheriff's office and asks for justice, not without the whole county watching them do it. They shot Ezra Vance without much apparent concern for who was watching. Ezra Vance was alone on a mountain trail. I intend to walk into that office in broad daylight, in front of half the town if I can arrange it." He looked at her steadily. I trust you to keep building the case while I am locked up where they cannot claim I ran from anything. That is, if you are still willing to keep building it, given what it has already cost you. I have never in my life stopped a thing halfway through because it became difficult, Mr. Ashford, she said, and something in the way she said it, chin lifted, eyes bright with a stubbornness that matched his own, made him laugh despite everything, a low, warm sound that eased something tight in her chest. No, he said, I do not suppose you have. He turned himself in 2 mornings later, riding down the main street of Larkspur Gulch in plain view, his wounded arm held stiff at his side, and gave himself over to a visibly startled Sheriff Boone with a calm dignity that Della, watching from the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, found almost unbearably moving. A crowd gathered, as he had hoped it would, murmuring, some faces hostile, a few faces uncertain, and Della understood that this was the first stone in what would need to be a very long wall, built one true fact at a time against the flood of easy lies. The jail was a squat stone building behind the courthouse, 2 cells and a small front room where Boone kept his desk, and Della visited every day she was in town, ostensibly to deliver newspapers and a book or two to ease the tedium of confinement, though everyone including Boone understood there was more to it than that. The town is still against him, she told Louis on one such visit, sitting on the small stool Boone allowed her to bring into the cell block, close enough to speak low. Garrett Prescott has been standing men drinks at the saloon all week, telling anyone who listens that you are a cold-blooded killer who ambushed a good man for the sake of grazing rights. And what do you tell them when they ask what you think? I tell them the truth, which is that the boundary filing on Bell Pass was forged, that a witness saw a Prescott man shoot another Prescott man before any shot came from your side, and that a man does not take a rifle ball in the back while murdering someone in cold blood. She met his eyes through the bars. Most of them do not want to hear it yet, but some are beginning to ask questions they were not asking a week ago. That matters, even if it does not feel like enough. It is more than I had any right to hope for. He reached through the bars, not quite touching her, an offer rather than a demand, and she closed the distance herself, her hand fitting into his rough, calloused palm with an ease that surprised them both. I have not thanked you properly, Della, for any of this, for not shooting me on sight, for one thing. You have thanked me plenty, she said, though her voice had gone softer than she intended. I did not do it to be thanked. I know that. It is part of why I am thanking you anyway. His thumb moved once lightly across her knuckles, and she felt the touch travel all the way up her arm, warm and startling. When this is over, whichever way it ends, I want you to know I do not regret a single hour of it, being found by you instead of by anyone else in this county. She did not trust her voice to answer that steadily, and so she only tightened her hand around his for a moment before letting go, aware of Boone's presence in the outer room, aware too of how quickly a private moment could become fuel for exactly the kind of gossip already working against them both. The break came 10 days later, and it came from a direction Della had not expected. Widow Calloway sent word by her eldest son, a quiet boy of 16 who rode 2 days to deliver a folded paper directly into Della's hands, with strict instructions to give it to no one else. Inside, in careful, deliberate handwriting, the widow had set down everything she had seen from the ridge above Bell Pass, signed and dated, along with a note that read simply, I have decided the note on my land matters less to me than the truth does. Use this however it does the most good, and God keep you both. Della wept a little, reading it from relief as much as gratitude, and rode directly to the boarding house where the circuit judge, Elias Thorne, was known to be passing through on his regular rounds of the mountain counties. She found him at supper, a thin, silver-haired man with sharp eyes that missed very little, and she laid the widow's statement and the courthouse boundary filing on the table before him without preamble. I would like 5 minutes of your time, Judge Thorne, regarding a man currently held in the Larkspur Gulch jail on a murder charge I believe to be entirely manufactured. Thorne read both documents twice, his expression giving away nothing, and then looked up at her with the particular scrutiny of a man accustomed to weighing evidence rather than reputations. "This is a serious accusation you are making against a prominent family, Miss Whittaker. It is a serious accusation because the facts are serious, Judge. I did not manufacture a forged notary date or an eyewitness account. I only found them. You realize Silas Prescott will not receive this quietly. I realize that a man is sitting in a cell right now because Silas Prescott's son wanted a mountain pass badly enough to have his own foreman killed and blame it on an innocent trail boss. I would rather Prescott receive it poorly than allow it to stand unchallenged." Thorne studied her a long moment, then folded the papers carefully. "I will need to review this properly and speak with the sheriff. It will take some days to arrange a hearing that cannot simply be quashed by the county commission before it starts. In the meantime, Miss Whittaker, I would advise you to be extremely careful. Men who forge boundary filings and arrange convenient killings do not generally surrender their advantage gracefully once they sense it slipping." It was advice she should have heeded more closely, though she would only understand that in hindsight. Garrett Prescott, it turned out, had ears in the boarding house dining room that evening, or perhaps simply enough natural cunning to guess what a judge's sudden interest in reviewing a settled case might mean. Within 2 days, word reached Della through Deputy Nate Cole, a young man who had joined the sheriff's office the previous autumn and who had, in the weeks since Louis' arrest, become increasingly uneasy about the way justice was being conducted in Larkspur County. "They are moving him," Nate told her, finding her alone at her wagon in the early morning before the town had properly woken. He kept his voice barely above a whisper, glancing over his shoulder. "Prescott convinced the commission that Ashford ought to be transferred to the territorial facility at Cross Timber for safekeeping, on account of, and I am quoting the commission's own language here, concerns about local sentiment running too high for a fair trial to be conducted in Larkspur Gulch. That is absurd. Local sentiment is running high because Garrett Prescott has spent 3 weeks paying for drinks and spreading lies. I know that, Miss Whittaker. I am telling you because I do not believe this transfer is what it claims to be. Garrett Prescott is arranging the escort himself, hand-picking the men, including Jesse Cobb. They are taking the high trail over Bell Pass rather than the wagon road, on account of the wagon road being washed out from the melt, they say, though I have ridden that road myself this week, and it is passable if a man is careful." Della felt the blood go cold in her veins. "They mean to kill him on the trail and claim he tried to escape. I cannot prove that. I only know it does not sit right with me, and I know Sheriff Boone signed off on it because Prescott made it sound like standard procedure, and I know the transfer leaves at first light tomorrow." Nate's young face was tight with something between fear and shame. "I am risking my position telling you this, ma'am. I would ask you not to say where you heard it. You have my word." She gripped his arm briefly. "Thank you, Nate, truly." She rode for Judge Thorne's lodgings before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, her mind already racing ahead through what would be needed, what papers, what authority, what speed. She found the judge dressing for his own departure, having planned to ride on to the next county that very morning, and she did not wait for an invitation before laying out everything Nate had told her. If Ashford is moved onto that trail tomorrow with Garrett Prescott's hand-picked men as his only escort, he will not arrive at Cross Timber alive, Judge Thorne. You know that as well as I do." Thorne's face had gone hard and grave. "I have already reviewed the widow's statement and the boundary filing thoroughly enough to know this case demands a proper hearing, Miss Whittaker, and I had intended to issue an order to that effect within the week through the usual channels." He moved to his writing case as he spoke, drawing out paper and ink with quick, decisive motions. "This changes the timeline considerably. I can issue an immediate order remanding Louis Ashford to my own jurisdiction for a formal hearing, superseding any transfer arranged by the county commission, on the grounds that credible new evidence has been presented that the original charge may rest on fraudulent documentation. Such an order carries the full weight of the territorial court, Prescott family or no Prescott family. Will it stop them if they are already on that trail with intentions of their own? An order is only as good as someone's willingness to enforce it in the moment it is needed, Miss Whittaker. I am an old man with a bad knee and no authority to ride mountain trails chasing down armed men. He handed her the finished document, ink still glistening, his seal pressed firm and official at the bottom. But you know that trail, or you know someone who does. I would suggest you do not waste the hours between now and dawn. Della rode through the night, first to Sheriff Boone's own house to rouse him from bed and press upon him both the judge's order and the plain fact that Nate Cole would corroborate every word of the escort's true intentions. And Boone, shamed and frightened in equal measure, agreed at last to ride with her himself, along with Nate, to intercept the transfer before it reached the narrows above Bell Pass where the earlier ambush had taken place, and where, Della was certain, whatever Garrett Prescott intended would happen again. They rode out before first light, 4 horses climbing hard into air that still held the bitter edge of the mountain winter, even as the calendar insisted on spring. And Della felt the altitude and the cold and the fear all pressing down together as the trail steepened beneath them. She had ridden this country 100 times delivering books and letters, but she had never ridden it with a man's life balanced on the speed of her own horse, and the difference changed everything about how the miles felt beneath her. They caught sight of the transfer party just past mid-morning, 3 riders and a shackled figure on a 4th horse, moving along the high shelf trail where the snowpack still clung thick and unstable to the slope above. Exactly the kind of terrain that made experienced mountain men nervous in the weeks when spring sun worked at the underside of a winter's accumulated weight. Garrett Prescott himself rode at the head of the party, and Jesse Cobb beside him, and Louis Ashford rode between them with his wrists bound and his face set in the particular stillness of a man who has already guessed what is coming, and has decided to meet it without giving his captors the satisfaction of visible fear. "Prescott," Boone called out as they closed the distance, his voice carrying thin in the cold air, "I am ordering this transfer halted. I have here an order from Judge Elias Thorne remanding the prisoner to his jurisdiction, effective immediately." Garrett Prescott turned in his saddle, and Della saw immediately that whatever calculation he had made about this morning's plans had not included interruption. His face, handsome in the hard way of a man who had never once in his life been told no and meant it, tightened with irritation quickly masked by contempt. "This is a legally authorized county transfer, Sheriff, approved by the Commission. I do not see what authority a circuit judge has to countermand a county decision made through proper channels. The order is right here, Garrett, with the judge's seal on it, and it supersedes anything the Commission approved, same as it always has." Boone held the paper up, though the distance was too great for anyone to actually read it, a gesture of authority more than evidence. "You are welcome to ride back to Larkspur Gulch and dispute it with the judge himself, but this prisoner is coming with me now." "Is he?" Garrett's hand moved, slow and deliberate, toward the pistol at his hip, and Cobb's followed a half-second behind, and Della felt every muscle in her body go tight as wire, aware suddenly of how very alone the 4 of them were on that narrow shelf of trail with a mountain of unstable snow looming above and a long fall waiting below. "Garrett," Louis's voice, quiet but carrying, cut through the tension. "Whatever you are planning to claim happened up here, there is a sheriff, a deputy, and the county librarian all present to see it happen plain. That is a great many witnesses for a story about a prisoner trying to escape. Shut your mouth. I am only pointing out the arithmetic, same as Della here would." Louis's eyes flicked toward her for just a moment, something steady and warm passing between them even in the middle of that terrible standoff. "You are not thinking this through the way your father would, Garrett. He would have found a quieter way." It was, Della understood later, precisely the kind of remark calculated to needle a proud young man already off balance. And it worked exactly as Louis must have intended, drawing Garrett's furious attention fully onto himself and away, for one crucial moment, from the trail and the mountain and the men around him. Jesse Cobb's horse, spooked by the raised voices and the sudden jerking motion as Garrett hauled his own mount half around in anger, stumbled sideways against the loose scree at the trail's uphill edge, and the sound of a shod hoof striking rock cracked out sharp and unexpected against the mountain silence. And above them, high on the slope where the winter's heavy accumulation had been sitting all these weeks growing heavier and less stable with every warm afternoon, something shifted. It began as a low sound, almost like a sigh, and then within 2 heartbeats it was a roar, a great white shoulder of snow breaking free from the ridge above and beginning its slide down toward the narrow shelf where 7 riders and their horses stood exposed with nowhere obvious to run. Off the trail. Louis shouted, and there was no calculation in his voice now, only the flat, urgent authority of a man who had spent his whole working life reading mountain danger and reacting to it a half-second before slower men understood what they were seeing. Downhill side, into the trees now, all of you move. For one terrible instant no one moved at all, frozen by the sight of that white wall descending, and then everything happened at once. Boone's horse bolted sideways of its own accord, carrying him clear toward a stand of stunted pine. Nate Cole wheeled his mount and drove hard for the same shelter. Cobb's already spooked horse reared and threw him, and Cobb scrambled on foot toward the trees with a speed panic alone could produce. Garrett Prescott, frozen with his pistol still half drawn, seemed for a moment likely to be caught entirely in the open. Della's horse, trained to steadiness by years of mountain travel, held long enough for her to see Louis, still bound at the wrists, unable to control his own mount properly, being carried sideways by his frightened horse directly into the path of the coming slide rather than away from it. She did not think. She drove her own horse forward, closing the gap in a handful of strides, and reached out to seize the cheek strap of his horse's bridle, hauling with all her strength to turn the animal's head toward the trees even as the roar behind them grew from thunder to something that seemed to fill the whole sky. Della, get clear. You cannot pull us both. I am not leaving you tied to a horse in the middle of an avalanche, so be quiet and hold on. They broke for the trees together, her horse and his crashing through the last stretch of open ground as the edge of the slide spray, powder thrown ahead of the main mass, engulfed them both in a stinging white cloud that stole the breath from her lungs. She felt her horse stumble, felt herself thrown hard against the animal's neck, and then somehow they were among the trees, the trunks close enough together to break the force of what followed, and the world went white and deafening and then, gradually, silent. When the roaring stopped and the snow settled and Della could see again, she found herself half fallen from her horse against a young pine, her ears ringing, snow packed into her collar and sleeves, and Louis beside her, still mounted but slumped forward, his bound hands white-knuckled around the saddle horn, blood trickling fresh from a cut above his eyebrow where a branch or falling debris had caught him. Louis. She scrambled up, ignoring the ache in her own bruised shoulder, and reached him just as he slid rather than dismounted from the horse, catching himself against her before his knees could buckle. Louis, look at me. Are you hurt beyond the cut? I am well enough. His voice was rough, but his eyes found hers and held, clear despite the shock plainly working through him. You came back for me. Of course I came back for you. Did you truly imagine I would not? Somewhere behind them, Boone's voice was calling out names, checking the scattered party, and Nate Cole's answering call came a moment later, shaken but whole. Garrett Prescott stumbled into view from a stand of trees farther down the slope, snow-covered and pale, and behind him came Jesse Cobb, thrown clear of his horse and limping badly, his face gray with something that looked far more like fear than injury alone could explain. It was Cobb who broke first, sinking down onto a fallen log with his head in his hands, shaking. And when Boone approached to ask if he was hurt, what came out of him instead was something none of them had expected. "I did not mean for it to go like this," Cobb said, his voice cracking. "Any of it. Vance did not want to go through with it either, once we were up on that trail and Garrett gave the order. Vance said we ought to just scare the drive off, not shoot anyone, and Garrett told him to keep his mouth shut about what the family needed. And when Vance would not, when Vance started saying he was going to tell the truth about the boundary filing being forged, Garrett told me to handle it." Cobb was weeping openly now, an ugly, broken sound in the cold mountain air. "I did it. I shot Ezra Vance, not this man here, and I have been sick with it every day since, watching them try to hang it on someone else while I said nothing, and I near got us all killed just now for the sake of finishing what Garrett started, and I am done. I am done covering for him." Garrett Prescott's face had gone the color of old ash. "Cobb, you fool, shut your mouth. You are talking yourself onto a gallows. I am already there, Garrett. We both are. The only question is whether I go there having told the truth or having let an innocent man hang for what I did." Cobb looked up, meeting Della's eyes, then Louis's, then Boone's. "I will say all of it before Judge Thorne, sworn and signed, whatever it costs me. I owe that much, at least, after everything." Della felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks, a tightness she had carried since the moment she first raised her rifle at a stranger and found, instead of a murderer, a man wrongly accused. She looked at Louis, snow still melting in his dark hair, blood drying above his eyebrow, his wrist still bound, though no one now seemed inclined to enforce that particular indignity a moment longer. And she reached up without entirely deciding to, and untied the rope herself, her fingers working the wet knots loose while he watched her with an expression she did not have a name for yet, though she suspected she would soon enough. "There," she said, once the rope fell away and he flexed his freed hands slowly, wincing at the returning circulation. "I believe that concludes this particular transfer, Mr. Ashford. I believe it does." He caught her hand before she could withdraw it fully, and this time there was no bars between them, no careful distance to maintain for propriety's sake in front of a jailhouse audience. "Della, yes, I meant what I said in that cell, about not regretting any of it being found by you." His thumb traced once across her knuckles, and around them the mountain silence pressed close, the snow still settling in soft drifts from branches disturbed by the slide, the others giving them, whether by accident or deliberate tact, a small measure of space. "I have been trying to think of some proper way to say what I feel, and I find I do not have the words a woman like you deserves to hear it in. I only know that I would rather have you beside me than any life I imagined for myself before I knew you existed." Della looked at him for a long moment, at the blood on his brow, and the exhaustion in his eyes and the plain, unguarded hope beneath both, and she thought of every careful, sensible reason she might have given a week ago for keeping her distance from a man whose troubles had already cost her business and reputation, and very nearly her life on a mountain trail. None of those reasons seemed to matter now, weighed against the simple fact of how it felt to stand this close to him with his hand around hers. She closed the last of the distance herself, rising up on her toes, and kissed him, brief and warm and entirely of her own choosing, before either of them could talk themselves into waiting for a more proper moment that might never come. "There," she said, echoing herself, though her voice had gone unsteady in a way it rarely did. "I believe that concludes a different kind of uncertainty, Mr. Ashford." He laughed, a real laugh this time, startled and delighted, and kissed her again longer, while Boone diplomatically busied himself checking on the horses and Nate Cole grinned at the sky and pretended to see nothing at all. The hearing before Judge Thorne took place 8 days later in the Larkspur Gulch courthouse, packed to its walls with townspeople who had, in the space of little more than a week, watched the entire shape of the story they thought they knew collapse and rebuild itself around a different truth entirely. Jesse Cobb testified first, haggard but resolute, laying out the full conspiracy from the forged boundary, filing to Garrett Prescott's order to silence Ezra Vance. Widow Calloway followed, her voice steady despite the note Garrett's father still technically held on her land, confirming what she had seen from the ridge. Sheriff Boone testified to the transfer's irregularities. Nate Cole testified to what he had overheard. Della herself testified to the discrepancy in the notary's daybook, laying the forged document before the judge with the same careful precision she brought to every ledger she had ever balanced. Garrett Prescott was arrested before the hearing's end on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and fraudulent filing of county documents, and Silas Prescott, who had sat through the entire proceeding with his face growing progressively more ashen, found himself, within the month, removed from the county commission by a unanimous vote of the remaining members, his family's grip on Larkspur County's courthouse broken as thoroughly and publicly as it had once been absolute. Louis Ashford walked out of that courthouse a free man, exonerated in full, and the same townspeople who had spat curses at him a fortnight before now pressed forward to shake his hand, to apologize, to ask forgiveness. He offered readily because he was, at his core, a man inclined toward grace once justice had been properly served. Della watched him accept their goodwill from the courthouse steps with a warmth in her chest that felt entirely new, pride and love tangled together, in a way she had never before experienced and did not particularly want to untangle. It took another month for the last of it to settle, for Cobb's full testimony to be recorded, and the boundary filing formally overturned, restoring Bell Pass to the open-range status it had held before Garrett Prescott's forgery, for the small ranchers of the valley to hold a meeting in the church hall to thank Louis publicly, and to thank Della, who they now understood had put her own livelihood and safety at risk on behalf of a stranger's justice. And by the time the last of the mountain snow had finally given up its grip on the high passes, and the valley had turned green and soft with the fullness of spring, life in Larkspur Gulch had settled into a new and steadier shape. Louis returned in those weeks to the quarter section along the river he had filed years before, finishing at last the small house he had been building piece by piece between cattle drives, and Della found her own book wagon route restored, families welcoming her back with an eagerness that had as much to do with gratitude as with genuine want of books and news, and word of what had happened in Larkspur County traveled with her along every mile of her circuit, told and retold at kitchen tables from the river bottoms to the high meadows. She visited Louis's homestead often that spring, at first with the same practical excuse of delivering him news of the trial's final resolution, and then, as the weeks passed, with no excuse at all beyond the plain wish to see him, to sit with him on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands while the light went gold and long across the valley. It was on one such evening, riding up the last stretch of trail toward his place with the sun already dropping behind Tanner's Ridge, that she noticed the second rocking chair. It sat on the porch beside the first, the one that had belonged to his mother, weathered and familiar, and this new chair was clearly freshly made, the wood pale and unweathered still, the joints tight and careful in a way that spoke of hours spent getting each detail right rather than the quick work of a man wanting only to be finished. She could see, even from a distance, where he had matched the curve of the rockers to the older chair beside it, where he had shaped the arms and the back to sit at a companionable angle to its neighbor, two chairs made to face the same view of the valley together rather than standing separate. She dismounted slowly, her eyes still on the chair, and found Louis standing in the doorway watching her with an expression caught somewhere between hope and the particular nervousness of a man who has done something he cannot take back and is not yet certain how it will be received. "You built a second chair," she said, because it seemed important to say the plain fact of it aloud before either of them attempted anything more complicated. "I did." He came down off the porch to meet her, wiping wood shavings from his hands onto his trousers, an unnecessary gesture that betrayed how unsettled he felt. I have been working on it 3 weeks now, evenings mostly, after the cattle work was done. You built it before I agreed to anything, Louis. Before I have said a single word about what I intend to do, whether I mean to keep my root, whether I mean to stay in this valley at all beyond what my father's work requires of me. I know that. He did not look away from her, though she could see what the admission cost him. I built it anyway, Della, because I have learned this spring that waiting for certainty before a man commits to what he wants is a poor way to live a life. I do not know what you intend. I am not asking you to give up your root, or your father's library, or the life you have built for yourself riding this county on your own judgment, because I have watched you do that work, and I would not ask any woman to set aside something she does that much good doing. I only wanted there to be a chair on this porch that was yours, whether you choose to sit in it once or every evening for the rest of both our lives. I did not want to ask you first and have you feel obligated to answer before you were ready. I only wanted it to be here in case. Della looked at the 2 chairs sitting side by side in the last of the evening light, at the careful, patient work of a man who had shaped an invitation out of wood and time rather than words and pressure, and she found that she did not, in that moment, have any words of her own that felt adequate to the size of what she was feeling. So she did not offer any. She walked past him, up the porch steps, and settled herself into the new rocking chair, feeling it take her weight smoothly, the joints holding firm and true, built by careful hands that had clearly measured twice for every cut, and she set it rocking gently with the toe of her boot and looked out over the valley turning purple and gold in the fading light, and she said nothing at all. Louis stood very still for a long moment, watching her, and then slowly, understanding dawned across his face, the particular joy of a man who has learned to read silence as fluently as speech, and he crossed the porch and settled into the chair beside her, his mother's chair, close enough that their joined armrests nearly touched, and together they rocked in a companionable rhythm as the first stars came out over Tanner's Ridge. "You are not going to say anything," he said eventually, though there was no complaint in it, only a warm and growing certainty. "No," she agreed. "I do not think I need to." They sat together like that until the valley had gone fully dark and the stars had filled in thick overhead, and it was only much later, after the silence had said everything it needed to say, that she finally spoke. "I intend to keep my root, Louis. I will not give up my father's work, not even for you, not even for this." She gestured at the chair beneath her, at the house behind them, at everything the evening had come to represent. "But I do not intend to stop coming back here either. I want this to be the place I return to, between circuits. I want it to be home, in whatever way a woman who spends half her life on the road can call anywhere home." "That is more than I hoped for," he said quietly. "I would not have asked you to be anything other than exactly what you are, Della. It is what I love about you, if I am honest, more than anything else. You love me. I believe I have for some weeks now, if I am honest about that too. I only did not know how to say it properly until you were sitting in that chair, saying nothing at all and somehow saying everything." She reached across the small space between the chairs and took his hand, the way she had first taken it through the bars of a jail cell, though everything about the touch felt different now, unburdened, certain. "I love you as well," she said. "I think I have since you showed me your wound instead of your rifle, and told me the truth instead of a story you thought I wanted to hear. There is one more thing I would ask of you, if you are willing to consider it." He turned in his chair to face her more fully. "The cattle drives will keep me away from this valley half of every year regardless of anything else, same as your route keeps you away the other half in different directions. I have been thinking, these past weeks, that perhaps those 2 callings need not pull us apart the way I once feared they would. The high trails you travel to reach the farthest homesteads are dangerous country, Della, avalanche country, exactly the kind of ground where a man who has spent his life reading mountain weather and mountain snow could make the difference between a safe delivery and a tragedy. I would like to ride with you, when the season allows it, on the roots that need that kind of knowledge most. Not to take over your work, or to protect you as though you needed protecting, because I have seen plainly enough that you do not. Only to be useful to something you have built, the way you were useful to something I nearly lost. Della felt her throat tighten with an emotion too large and warm to name easily. You would leave the cattle drives. Only the ones that do not need me most. I have built a good name driving herds through this valley, and I do not intend to abandon that work, because it is honest work and I am proud of it, and because the small ranchers here still need someone they trust to get their cattle safely to market. But there is time enough in a year for both, if we are patient about the arranging of it, and I find I would rather arrange my life around both the things I love than keep them separate simply, because it might be simpler that way. That sounds, Della said slowly, feeling the truth of it settle warm and certain in her chest, like exactly the kind of life I would want to build with you. He kissed her then, slow and unhurried, with all the patience of a man who had learned that the best things were worth building carefully, one true joint and one honest board at a time. And when they finally drew apart, the valley was fully dark around them, the stars bright and closed the way they only were at that altitude, and the two rocking chairs sat empty behind them for a moment as they stood together at the porch rail, looking out over the land that would be, from that evening forward, unmistakably and permanently theirs. They were married that autumn, in the small church at Larkspur Gulch, with Widow Calloway and Sheriff Boone and Deputy Nate Cole and half the ranching families of the valley crowded into pews that had rarely held so full a congregation, and Judge Elias Thorne, passing through on his circuit at exactly the right time by design rather than accident, offered a toast at the modest gathering afterward that made even the sternest ranchers in attendance laugh aloud. Jesse Cobb, having served his sentence for his part in the conspiracy with the reduced severity his testimony had earned him, sent a letter of congratulations from the territorial prison that Della read aloud to Louis on their wedding night, both of them quiet afterward, grateful in a complicated way for the truth that had cost so much and freed so much in equal measure. Garrett Prescott was tried separately and convicted of conspiracy to murder, his father's influence in the county broken so thoroughly that Silas Prescott sold his remaining holdings within the year and left the valley entirely, an ending that felt, to everyone who had lived through the spring's events, exactly as just as such things ever managed to be in a hard and imperfect world. Della kept her route, as she had promised, riding out each week with her wagon of books and letters and newspapers to families scattered across the high meadows and river bottoms of Larkspur County. And when the trail led through avalanche country in the dangerous weeks of early spring, Louis rode beside her, reading the snow the way she read the small telling details of a forged document, the two of them combining what each had learned from a hard life in wild country into something neither could have built alone. And every evening they were both home together, without fail, without exception. They sat side by side on the porch of the house he had built and she had chosen, in two rocking chairs matched and companionable beneath the wide mountain sky, watching the light go gold and then purple and then dark over the valley that had tested them both and given them, in the end, exactly the life neither of them had quite dared to hope for.